I'd owned the narrow strip beside my house for 13 years without anybody paying much attention to it. Then one Thursday morning I came home to find a contractor pouring 8 concrete footings exactly 6 feet and 9 inches across my property line. The restaurant owner next door had decided that my land would make the perfect covered dining patio. He spent $48,000 building it. What he didn't know was that the city permit keeping his new patio open contained one sentence that made every table, every light fixture, and every dollar he'd invested depend on my signature. My name's Daniel Mercer, and I live in a little neighborhood outside Asheville, North Carolina. It's one of those areas that never quite decided whether it wanted to stay residential or become commercial. We've got brick ranch houses from the 70s, 2 churches, a dentist's office, a small grocery store, and a row of businesses along the main road. My house sits on the corner. I bought it 13 years ago after retiring from a regional utility company. Nothing fancy. 3 bedrooms, a detached garage, and just under 3/4 of an acre. The unusual part is the eastern boundary. My lot includes a narrow strip of land running between my driveway and the building next door. It's about 9 feet wide at the front and widens to a little over 11 feet near the back. Most people assumed it belonged to the commercial property. It didn't. The strip existed because the original developer had planned a service road back in 1978. The road was never built, and the land eventually became part of my residential parcel. I knew exactly where the boundary was. When I bought the house, a licensed surveyor set 4 iron pins and gave me a stamped survey showing the strip as part of Lot 14. For years, the building next door was a quiet insurance office. The employees occasionally walked across the strip to check an air conditioning unit, and I never made an issue out of it. Then the office closed. A man named Travis Boone bought the building and turned it into a restaurant called Copper Ridge Kitchen. Travis wasn't a bad guy when I first met him. He was 43, energetic, and always talking about locally sourced food and supporting neighborhood businesses. He'd put most of his savings into the restaurant. According to him, the interior renovation alone cost nearly $300. I wanted him to succeed. A good restaurant was better than an empty building, and Travis initially made an effort to get along with everyone. He gave nearby residents discount cards and invited the HOA board to a private opening. The first small warning came about 4 months later. His employees started leaving trash cans on my strip. I walked over and asked Travis to move them behind his building. He apologized and handled it that afternoon. 2 weeks later, a delivery driver parked there. Then a landscaping company spread gravel along 3 feet of the strip without asking me. Each incident was small enough to seem accidental. Each time Travis apologized, but he never asked where the property line actually was. By the following spring, his restaurant was doing well on weekends but struggling during the week. Travis decided outdoor dining would fix that. The problem was that his lot didn't have enough usable space. Mine did. I left town for 4 days in April to help my daughter move into a new apartment in Raleigh. When I came home Thursday morning, there was a concrete truck beside my driveway. 4 workers had removed the gravel from the narrow strip. They'd dug 8 holes, placed steel post brackets inside them, and were pouring concrete. Blue construction string ran from the restaurant's rear wall toward the sidewalk. The string crossed my survey pin, not by a few inches, by 6 feet and 9 inches. I parked in my driveway and asked the foreman what they were building. Covered patio, he said. 28 by 42. Should be framed by Monday. I told him part of the patio was on my property. He looked at the approved plan in his hand and shrugged. We're building where the owner marked it. I asked him to pause until Travis arrived. To the foreman's credit, he stopped the pour. About 20 minutes later, Travis came outside carrying a rolled set of construction drawings. He wasn't apologetic this time. He told me the HOA Architectural Committee had approved the patio and the city had issued a building permit. I said neither the HOA nor the city could give him ownership of my land. Travis unrolled his site plan on the hood of a pickup truck. A dotted line labeled Existing Use Boundary ran almost directly beside my driveway. It wasn't the legal property line. I showed him the iron survey pin less than 3 feet from where he was standing. He barely looked at it. That old marker doesn't control current use, he said. This area has served the commercial building for decades. That explained how he thought he could get away with it. Travis believed the previous insurance office's occasional use of the strip had created some kind of permanent right. He'd also hired a drafting company to prepare the permit plan, not a licensed boundary surveyor. The plan used an aerial tax map. Tax maps are useful for estimating property locations, but they aren't boundary surveys. I explained that to him. He told the contractor to continue. That afternoon, I called the county surveyor's office and then the police department's non-emergency number. The officer who returned my call was polite but clear. Property line encroachments are usually civil matters. Unless someone damaged my home, threatened me, or violated a court order, the police weren't going to stop a permitted construction project. I could sue, of course. A local real estate attorney estimated that an injunction and encroachment lawsuit could cost between $12,000 and $20,000 if Travis fought it. Even a straightforward case might take a year. I probably would have won. I also would have spent a small fortune proving something already printed on my deed. Instead, I hired the same surveying company that had surveyed my property when I bought it. They came out 9 days later. The surveyor located the original iron pins, checked them against the recorded 1,978 subdivision plat, and set temporary wooden stakes along the legal boundary. His final measurement showed that the patio occupied 286 square feet of my land. 3 support columns, part of the concrete floor, an electrical trench, and nearly 7 feet of the roof crossed the line. The stamped survey cost me $1,180. I sent Travis a copy by certified mail. I also sent it to the contractor. The contractor stopped working on the portion inside my property, but the structure was already more than halfway finished. Travis hired a different crew and completed it anyway. 2 weeks later, Copper Ridge opened the patio. There were 12 tables, hanging lights, portable heaters, and a decorative wooden wall facing my driveway. On Friday nights, I could hear diners talking 10 feet from my bedroom windows. The patio added 46 seats to a restaurant that only had 64 seats inside. It wasn't a decorative improvement. It was a 42% increase in Travis's maximum seating capacity, and 286 square feet of it belonged to me. I didn't want the restaurant closed. I didn't even insist that Travis immediately tear the patio down. I met with a real estate attorney and had her prepare a simple temporary land use license. The license would allow Copper Ridge to use the 286 square feet for 12 months. Travis would pay $475 per month, maintain liability insurance, and agree that the permission could be terminated with 60 days' notice. Most importantly, the agreement would acknowledge that I still owned the land. The price wasn't random. My attorney compared local commercial ground rents and adjusted for the small area involved. Over 12 months, Travis would pay $5,700. That was cheaper than moving the 3 columns and rebuilding part of the roof. It was also cheaper than litigation for either of us. I took the agreement to him on a Tuesday afternoon before the dinner crowd arrived. "I'm giving you a way to keep the patio open," I said. "You get a year to decide whether you want to redesign it, buy the strip, or renew the license." Travis skimmed the first page. Then he laughed. He said the land had been used by the commercial property for more than 20 years and that his attorney believed he could claim an easement. I asked whether his attorney had seen my survey. "He doesn't need to," Travis said. "You're not going to shut down the most successful restaurant in this neighborhood over a strip of weeds." That was his memorable line, not because it was clever, because it told me exactly what he thought of the situation. He didn't believe the land belonged to him. He believed my ownership didn't matter enough for me to defend it. I kept my voice level. "I'm not asking you to shut down. I'm asking you to stop using property you don't own without permission." Travis pushed the agreement back across the table. He said the HOA was behind him. That part was mostly true. The HOA president, Linda Carver, loved having Copper Ridge in the neighborhood. The restaurant hosted board dinners, donated appetizers to community events, and gave board members priority reservations. 3 days after my meeting with Travis, I received a letter from the HOA Architectural Committee. The letter accused me of interfering with an approved neighborhood improvement. It warned that placing stakes near the patio could create a safety hazard. I checked the governing documents. The HOA had authority over exterior design, signage, and certain landscaping changes. It had no authority to transfer private property from one owner to another. I replied with my deed and survey. Linda sent back a 2-sentence email saying the board considered the matter closed. Travis then posted about the dispute in a neighborhood Facebook group. He didn't use my name, but he described an anti-business neighbor trying to destroy 40 local jobs over unused ground. The post got more than 100 comments. People who had never seen my deed called me greedy. A few suggested that Travis should take the land through adverse possession. That wasn't how adverse possession worked. In North Carolina, a standard adverse possession claim generally requires 20 years of qualifying possession unless the claimant has color of title, which can shorten the period under specific circumstances. Occasional access by insurance employees wasn't open exclusive possession by Travis. He'd owned the building for less than 2 years. There was no recorded easement either. Travis's lawyer eventually sent me a letter claiming a historic implied use. My attorney reviewed it, and said the argument was weak, but defeating it in court would still take time and money. That was what Travis was counting on. He'd already spent $48,000. Admitting he was wrong meant losing the patio, the additional seating, and his reputation with the HOA board. Pride had joined the balance sheet. I could have filed suit. Instead, I went to the city planning office and requested the restaurant's complete permit file. 7 business days later, they emailed me 112 pages. Page 84 changed everything. Copper Ridge's outdoor seating approval was conditional. The approved site plan showed the entire patio within the restaurant parcel, and the application included a certification signed by Travis. The certification stated that he owned or had written authorization to use all land shown in the application. He had neither. The permit also required the restaurant to maintain 42 off-street parking spaces because of the increased seating capacity. The patio columns had eliminated 3 of those spaces. Travis hadn't just built across my boundary. He'd built a patio that no longer matched the plan the city had approved. That was the moment I knew exactly what I was going to do. My plan had 3 steps. None of them required a lawsuit. The first step was to create a clean public record. My attorney prepared a notice of disputed encroachment containing my legal description, the license survey photographs of the columns, and a copy of the temporary license Travis had rejected. We mailed Travis a final 10-day notice. It gave him 3 options: sign the license, remove the encroachment, or provide a recorded document proving he had the right to use the land. He did none of them. After the deadline, we recorded the notice with the County Register of Deeds. The notice didn't automatically place a lien on his building or declare me the winner. That wasn't its purpose. It documented that a boundary dispute existed. Any title company reviewing Travis's property would now see it. Any lender refinancing the restaurant would ask questions. Any buyer would demand that the encroachment be resolved. Travis called me the morning after it was recorded. For the first time, he sounded nervous. He had been negotiating a $220,000 equipment loan to expand his kitchen. The lender's title review had found the notice. He accused me of sabotaging his business. I reminded him that I'd offered him a 12-month license. He hung up. Step 2 involved the city. I filed a written request for zoning and building review. I included the stamped survey photographs taken over 6 weeks, Travis's rejected license, and the permit page where he certified that he controlled the entire site. I didn't demand an emergency response. There was no emergency. 9 business days later, a zoning officer and a building inspector visited Copper Ridge. They measured the patio against the approved plan. They confirmed that 3 structural columns crossed the legal boundary. They also found the missing parking spaces and an electrical circuit installed outside the permitted construction area. The city issued a notice of violation. Travis had 30 days to submit a corrected site plan, prove legal control of the land, or remove the encroaching portion. The electrical work received a separate correction notice. The restaurant could continue operating indoors, but the city suspended use of the patio until the violations were resolved. Travis appealed. The appeal bought him time, but it didn't reopen the patio. His permit had been approved based on a materially inaccurate site plan. The HOA president attended the appeal hearing and argued that the patio benefited the community. The zoning administrator asked whether the HOA owned my lot. Linda said no. He asked whether the HOA had an easement across it. She said she didn't know. That was pretty much the end of the HOA's contribution. The appeal board upheld the suspension. Travis still had one possible solution: me. He called and offered to sign the original 12-month license. But the situation had changed. When I offered that agreement, the patio had been newly built, and we still had a chance to resolve the matter quietly. Since then, Travis had completed construction after receiving the survey, misrepresented the dispute online, involved the HOA, and forced me to spend thousands protecting my title. I didn't refuse to negotiate. I sent him a revised proposal. The new license required $850 per month, reimbursement of my $3 460 inches survey and legal expenses, proof of $2 million in liability coverage, and a firm expiration date after 18 months. The increased monthly rate reflected commercial use, the permanent columns, evening noise, and the fact that the patio restricted access along the side of my house. Travis called the price extortion. My attorney pointed out that he was free to remove the structure and pay me nothing. He rejected the second offer. That brought us to step 3. I submitted a written objection to his corrected outdoor seating application. This wasn't a complaint to the State Alcohol Commission, and it wasn't an attempt to cancel his restaurant license. His indoor business could keep serving food and alcohol. The issue was narrower. The city required every outdoor dining area to be located on land controlled by the applicant. Travis's revised plan still included my 286 square feet, and he still didn't have my authorization. Without that area, the patio couldn't meet the required setbacks, pedestrian clearance, and table spacing shown in the application. Travis tried redesigning it. An architect produced 3 versions. The first moved the columns but left the roof overhanging my land. The second fit within his boundary but blocked the required service passage behind the building. The third reduced the patio to 16 seats and required relocating a grease interceptor and 2 air conditioning units. That version could have worked. It also would have cost approximately $31,000. By then, the patio had been closed for 11 weeks, including most of the summer tourist season. According to figures Travis later submitted during the permit appeal, the restaurant lost an estimated $38,600 inches projected patio revenue. The equipment lender also delayed his loan until the recorded encroachment was cleared. Travis had wanted 286 square feet of land without paying $5,700 for a 1-year license. His refusal had now put more than $70,000 at risk. He made one final attempt to pressure me. A lawyer offered me $9,000 for permanent ownership of the strip. I declined. Selling it would have brought commercial activity within a few feet of my house forever. It also would have reduced my side setback and potentially complicated any future addition to my garage. I wasn't holding out for more money. The land simply wasn't for sale. That distinction seemed difficult for Travis to understand. 4 months after I found the concrete truck beside my driveway, Travis accepted the 16-seat redesign. His contractor removed the 3 columns from my land's saw cut, the encroaching concrete, and shortened the roof. The work took 12 days. The final reconstruction cost him $29,400. The electrical corrections and revised architectural drawings added another $6,800. His patio remained closed for a total of 127 days. Between construction costs, permit fees, professional services, and the revenue estimate he gave the city himself, the dispute cost Copper Ridge a little over $76,000. That was more than 13 times the cost of the original license I'd offered him. Once the encroachment was removed, my surveyor inspected the property again. Travis paid to restore the soil, repair the drainage channel, and install a narrow privacy fence entirely inside his own boundary. I signed a document confirming the physical encroachment had been corrected. My attorney recorded it so the title record would show the dispute was resolved. The equipment lender released Travis's loan 2 months later. Copper Ridge didn't close. Travis didn't go bankrupt, lose his home, or get dragged away in handcuffs. That wouldn't have been justice. It would have been theater. He kept his restaurant. He just had to run it on land he actually owned. The HOA quietly withdrew its warning about my survey stakes. At the next annual meeting, the board adopted a rule requiring licensed boundary documentation before approving any project located within 10 feet of a property line. Linda never apologized. I didn't need her to. Travis and I aren't friends, but we're civil. When we pass each other near the mailbox, we nod. His smaller patio stays busy on warm evenings, and the privacy fence keeps most of the noise away from my house. As for the narrow strip, I planted native shrubs along it and added stepping stones leading to my garage. It still isn't the most valuable-looking part of my property. That was never the point. Property rights don't disappear because somebody else has a more profitable use for your land. And patience doesn't mean permission. Travis spent $76,000 learning something I'd offered to put in writing for $475 a month. I never wanted to shut down his restaurant. I just made sure his success stopped depending on pretending my signature didn't matter. Sometimes the smartest way to protect what's yours isn't to destroy what someone else built. It's to let their own paperwork tell the truth. What would you have done? Would you have offered Travis the temporary license, forced him to remove the patio immediately, or sold him the strip at a premium? Tell me in the comments. I spent 27 years as a U.S. Customs and Border Protection art authentication specialist examining questionable provenance claims and counterfeit artwork moving through American ports before I retired to a small coastal artist colony in Northern California called Cypress Cove, built around a recorded easement that keeps one shared kiln house and gallery loading path open to every member who needs to fire and sell their own work. Then a new resident, told wrongly by a city permit clerk that our colony had no separate review process of its own, built a permanent kiln shed directly across that shared loading path, blocking every member's access to the gallery for the better part of a summer. When I asked our co-op board to enforce the easement protecting that path, I learned that the gallery director we'd trusted to sell our work honestly for 10 years had been quietly underreporting nearly every sale price and pocketing the difference the entire time. By the time the state finished with him, the blocked path was the smallest thing he'd taken. My name is Salve Kastrup. I'm 64 and I spent 27 years as an art authentication specialist for U.S. Customs and Border Protection, examining suspect provenance documents and counterfeit artwork at ports along the West Coast before I retired 5 years ago to a small ceramics studio inside a coastal artist colony called Cypress Cove, tucked into a stretch of cypress forest above the Mendocino coastline. My husband Torvald passed 5 years ago, almost exactly when I retired, and these days it's mostly my daughter Signe down in Sacramento who calls to check on me most weekends. Cypress Cove was organized in 1979 by a group of working artists who pooled their savings to buy a stretch of forested coastal land together, back when nobody else wanted property, this remote and this expensive to build on, and built a modest community of 31 studio cottages around one shared amenity that made the whole thing possible: a wood-fired kiln house large enough for serious ceramic work, and a small gallery where the colony's pooled output gets shown and sold to the tourists and collectors who make the long drive up the coast. Rather than each artist maintaining separate kiln access and separate sales arrangements, the founding members recorded a kiln house and gallery access easement across every deed in the colony, granting the co-op the authority and the obligation to keep one shared loading path open between every studio and both the kiln house and the gallery. I want to explain why that loading path matters as much as it does, because it's the whole reason this story unfolds the way it does. A working ceramics colony doesn't function on foot traffic alone. Firing a kiln means hauling greenware, sometimes hundreds of pounds of it, from a studio to the kiln house on a fixed firing schedule that can't simply wait for an obstruction to clear. And getting finished work to the gallery for sale means moving fragile, valuable pieces along that same corridor without a detour that risks breakage. The path isn't decorative. It's the entire physical infrastructure this colony's actual livelihood depends on. I've served on the co-op's facilities committee for 4 of my 5 years, here a volunteer role that mostly involves reviewing any proposed construction near the shared path, coordinating the kiln house's firing schedule with the colony's dozen or so active potters and sculptors, and occasionally walking a disputed stretch of the corridor with a newer member who isn't sure what the recorded easement actually requires of them. It's work that lets me use the same close, skeptical attention to documentation that defined my whole customs career, just aimed at a coastal artist colony instead of a shipping container full of questionable antiquities. Our co-op has always relied on one hired professional to run the shared gallery's daily operations, a director named Osgood Vane, retained for 10 consecutive years to handle consignment sales, coordinate visiting collectors, and they report back to each member exactly what their own work had sold for and what commission the gallery retained. Osgood came recommended by a regional arts council that helped several small coastal colonies establish professional gallery representation, and over 10 years he built a reputation as the one person who understood the actual commercial art market well enough that the rest of the volunteer board, myself included, rarely questioned his sales reports in any real depth. My days these days run on the studio's own rhythm, just from a converted garage instead of a customs inspection bay. Mornings mean throwing and trimming the quiet, repetitive work that still surprises me some days with how much it resembles the careful, patient examination I used to do professionally. Afternoons mean glazing or loading the kiln when it's my turn in the firing rotation. It's a rhythm that took some adjustment after 27 years of an inspector's more adversarial schedule, but it's become the thing I genuinely look forward to now, even during the most frustrating glaze test. Cypress Cove has changed some since the founding artist first organized it the way any 45-year-old artist colony eventually does. A handful of founding members are still here, people who remember hauling their own greenware to a kiln house that hadn't yet had a real firing schedule before the co-op ever formalized one. But a growing share of newer residents bought in specifically for the studio space and the coastal setting rather than any real involvement in the colony's governance. Residents who understand Cypress Cove exists but don't always understand why the loading path easement and the gallery sales process matter as much as they do. I don't hold that against anyone. You don't need to understand consignment accounting to love working in clay above the Mendocino coast, but it does mean fewer and fewer members each year could actually explain the colony's shared obligations from memory, myself and a shrinking handful of others aside. My own studio these days sits close enough to the shared loading path that I can hear the kiln crew hauling greenware most mornings during a firing week, close enough that I've probably logged more hours watching that particular stretch of gravel than any other member of this colony. I've spent enough mornings examining a piece's glaze for the kind of hairline crazing that tells you a firing went wrong somewhere along the way, the same close. The patient attention I used to bring to a suspect provenance document to understand exactly how much invisible care sits underneath something that looks from a gallery floor like nothing more complicated than a finished bowl. I came to ceramics almost by accident, the way a lot of career changes happen when you're not actually looking for one. Torvald bought me a beginner's wheel throwing class for our 30th anniversary, mostly as a joke about how much time I spent handling other people's art without ever making anything of my own, and I hated it for the first 4 sessions before something clicked during the 5th. Some small adjustment in how I was centering the clay that suddenly made the whole absurd process make sense. I kept at it quietly for the better part of a decade before I retired, working out of a rented studio space on weekends, never quite admitting to myself how much I was already planning a second life around it. Torvald used to say I approached a lump of wet clay with the same suspicious patient scrutiny I brought to a questionable 18th century provenance letter, which he meant as a compliment and which I've come to understand really was one, since both disciplines reward exactly the same kind of stubborn attention to a thing that doesn't want to reveal what's actually wrong with it. Torvald and I bought into this colony the year I made senior specialist, back when a federal salary and a freelance illustrator's income together could just barely stretch to a studio cottage if you didn't mind a place that needed real renovation work. He illustrated children's books from a converted sunroom for most of 30 years, and he used to joke that between the two of us we'd covered every angle of telling a real thing from a fake one. Him drawing creatures that never existed, convincingly enough that children believed in them completely, and me making sure nobody sold a genuine forgery as something it wasn't. He passed quietly in his sleep the winter after I retired. The kind of ending that still strikes me as almost unfair given how much he'd been looking forward to slower mornings together after 3 decades of both of us working, demanding unpredictable schedules. Sini was already settled in Sacramento with her own family by then, and I've never quite decided whether staying in this studio alone was the right call or simply the only one I was willing to consider seriously at the time. I still remember 5 years ago sitting through my first facilities committee meeting and watching Osgood walk the room through that year's gallery, sales figures and commission structure with the easy, practiced fluency of a man who'd clearly done this many times before, citing collector interest and regional market comparisons with a confidence the rest of us simply took at face value. I remember thinking at the time how fortunate we were to have a director this commercially savvy, handling something this financially important to every member's actual livelihood. It didn't occur to me until years later, with my own professional background in exactly this kind of careful documentation review, to wonder whether that same fluency might eventually become exactly the kind of cover a real problem could hide behind. The studio cottage nearest the colony's main entrance, a modest property that had sat empty for a couple of years after its previous owner moved away, sold last spring to a man named Rutger Sandoval, an accomplished sculptor who wanted to build his own small personal kiln shed rather than rely entirely on the colony's shared firing schedule. Rutger went to the county building department to pull the appropriate permit, and the clerk who processed his application, working from an outdated internal note in the county's own files, describing Cypress Cove as a standard residential subdivision with no separate architectural review, authority told him explicitly that no additional colony-level approval was required beyond the standard county building permit. It wasn't until construction crews began clearing the site that anyone on the facilities committee realized where Rutger's kiln shed was actually going up. The footprint sat directly across the gravel loading path connecting nearly a third of the colony's studios to the shared kiln house and gallery, a corridor Rutger's own county permit paperwork never mentioned at all, since the county's own outdated records had never flagged the colony's recorded easement in the first place. I walked over to Rutger's site the same week. Construction began mostly out of the same instinct that had made me flag 100 provenance documents that looked complete on paper but were missing exactly the one record that actually mattered. "I don't think we've properly met," I said. "I'm Solveig from the Facilities Committee. Your kiln shed's footprint sits directly across our shared loading path, and I understand you were told the county permit was all you needed." Rutger looked genuinely stunned at the news. "I specifically asked the county clerk whether there was anything else required for a colony like this one," he said. "She told me flatly that Cypress Cove had no separate review authority on file, that it was treated the same as any other rural parcel. If there's an actual recorded easement here, that's news. The county itself apparently doesn't have documented correctly. There's a recorded easement running directly through where your foundation is being poured," I told him. "It not something the county's general permitting process would necessarily know to flag if their own records never picked it up." Would you be willing to pause construction while we sort out exactly what the county's file is missing? Please do, Rutger said with what struck me as genuine alarm rather than any defensiveness. I built exactly what I was told I was allowed to build based on what the county itself told me. If their own records are simply wrong, I want that fixed and I want to make this right with everyone here. I want to explain why I didn't simply treat the county's own erroneous guidance as the end of the matter, since a resident or two suggested exactly that once word got around. Our colony's recorded easement had been filed with the county decades ago alongside the original 1,979 subdivision documents, and yet somehow the county's own current permit desk records had never carried that easement forward into whatever internal reference the clerk had actually consulted. That gap wasn't Rutger's fault, and it wasn't fully the clerk's fault either, in the sense that she was working from records the county itself had allowed to go stale. But it was a gap that had just cost this colony its primary loading corridor, regardless of who was ultimately responsible for it. I pulled our recorded easement from the co-op's own files that same week, along with the original 1,979 subdivision survey the founding artists had commissioned before the colony was ever formally organized documents. I'd reviewed more than once in my 4 years on the Facilities Committee. The easement was exactly as specific as I remembered any construction anywhere near the loading corridor required a formal Facilities Committee review, filed and cross-referenced with the county's own permit records specifically to prevent exactly this kind of gap, a cross-reference that had apparently lapsed at the county's end, sometime over the past 4 decades, without anyone here or at the county ever catching it. I called the county's own permit desk directly that same week, mostly to understand how an easement filed with the county itself had failed to appear in the county's own current records. Our internal cross-reference system for older recorded easements outside standard subdivisions occasionally falls out of sync when we migrate to newer record-keeping software, the department's compliance officer told me, sounding genuinely embarrassed. This isn't the first gap like this we've found, though I'll admit it's a more consequential one than most. We should have caught this ourselves well before it ever reached a permit applicant. That answer, much like a documentation lapse I might have found reviewing a government agency's own decades-old customs manifest system, sounded like a genuine institutional record-keeping failure rather than anything more troubling, and I took it at exactly that value from the start. The real question in front of me wasn't whether Rutger or the county clerk had acted in bad faith, neither plainly had, but how quickly we could restore the loading path before the colony's next scheduled firing, and how to make sure this particular gap in the county's own system got permanently corrected. I walked the blocked corridor the following day with our contracted structural consultant documenting exactly how much of the loading path Rutger's new foundation actually occupied against what the easement guaranteed, the same close, methodical documentation. I used to build a case file before, ever flagging a suspect shipment for further inspection. The obstruction was unambiguous, a poured foundation sitting squarely across ground that had served as open loading access for 4.5 decades. I brought the findings to the full Facilities Committee at an emergency meeting called that same week. This wasn't Rutger acting in bad faith, and it wasn't really the county clerk's fault either. I told the board, but a records gap at the county level has left us without our primary loading corridor, right as several members are scheduled for kiln firings this summer. Maybe the affected members can just carry their work the long way around through the parking area. One board member offered a response that struck me as more interested in avoiding an uncomfortable confrontation with a new resident than actually addressing what had happened. I retained a property rights attorney the following week, a sharp patient specialist named Rosamond Atwood, who'd handled a handful of recorded easement disputes involving county record-keeping failures for other small California communities before ours. This is a fairly clean case once you separate the two issues, she told me during our first meeting, spreading the survey and the structural consultant's measurements across her desk. Your new resident relied, in good faith, on what a county official directly told him. The county's own internal cross-reference system failed to carry an easement forward that it had every obligation to preserve. Neither one requires anything dramatic against Rutger personally. It just requires relocating his foundation and getting the county to formally correct its own records so this never happens to the next applicant. Rosamond sent Rutger a straightforward request to relocate his kiln shed's foundation, and he agreed without any resistance, genuinely eager to fix a problem he hadn't understood he'd created. She separately sent the county a formal demand to correct its own permit desk cross-reference system and to issue written confirmation that Cypress Cove's easement had been permanently restored to its active records, closing the exact gap that had let a stale internal note override a real recorded legal document. I brought the resolution to Rutger, directly catching him at his half-poured foundation one afternoon. I want you to know none of us think you did anything wrong here, I told him. You asked the right question and got the wrong answer from the one office that should have known better. This is on the county's own records, not on you. I appreciate you saying that, Rutger said. I never wanted my own kiln shed to cost this whole colony its loading path for a season. I'll relocate the foundation immediately, whatever it costs, and I'd like to help make sure the county actually fixes its own system properly. I called Merrick Kettering, our co-op's board president, over coffee a few days later, mostly to talk through how a county-level records failure this significant had gone unnoticed for as long as it apparently had. That's genuinely on the county, not on any board we've ever had here, he said, setting his cup down slowly. We recorded that easement decades ago in good faith, and never had a reason to check whether the county's own internal system still reflected it accurately. Rosamond laid out a straightforward path for this first dispute, since there was no real disagreement to resolve once everyone understood what had actually happened. Rutger relocated his kiln shed's foundation to a spot clear of the loading corridor at his own expense, and the county formally corrected its own permit desk records and issued written confirmation of the colony's active easement. This one resolves itself quickly because everyone involved is acting in good faith, including the county, once it understood its own error, Rosamond told me. The real work here is making sure this particular gap in the county's own system gets permanently closed, so it can't blindside the next applicant the way it blindsided Rutger. Here's the micro setback: relocating a partially poured concrete foundation required breaking out and removing the existing pour before a new one could be placed correctly, which took considerably longer than a fresh build would. It'd have, and the colony's loading path remained partially. It obstructed for several additional weeks while the removal work proceeded around an active summer firing schedule. This is the frustrating part of doing the correction properly, our structural consultant told me. Rushing the removal risks damaging the surrounding gravel base the loading path actually depends on, and then we're fixing two problems instead of one. Those additional weeks were harder on the colony's summer firing schedule than I let on to Merrick during our regular check-ins, since several members had to reroute heavy greenware around a genuinely awkward detour during exactly the stretch of the year when gallery sales to summer tourists matter most. The relocated foundation was completed within 6 weeks. Rutger covering the complete cost of the removal and rebuild, and the county's corrected records were formally confirmed in writing. At the same time, the loading path was restored to full access. I want you to know I don't hold any of this against your colony, Rutger told me at a community gathering not long after. Everybody handled it honestly once the problem was understood, including eventually the county itself. I just wish I'd pushed harder for something in writing before I ever broke ground. I remember that gathering feeling like about as clean a resolution as a blocked easement dispute ever gets: an honest institutional failure, an honest response, and a fix that actually addressed the real underlying problem rather than just punishing whoever happened to be standing closest to it. It's strange now, looking back, how contained that whole matter felt at the time, given everything it turned out to be the opening chapter of. I assumed once Rutger's situation resolved that this was the end of it. I was wrong. And it was Rosamund's own routine step of pulling several years of the gallery's own consignment sale records to confirm the corrected county filing wouldn't complicate any existing sales agreements that show me exactly how wrong. While reviewing those consignment records, Rosamund noticed that several of my own pieces sold through the gallery over the past few years were recorded at sale prices meaningfully lower than what she found the exact same pieces had actually sold for based on a collector's own public auction resale listing she happened to come across. I brought the discrepancy to Rosamund the following week, mostly expecting a reasonable explanation involving resale markups collectors sometimes apply, and what her subsequent records request uncovered reframed the entire situation. Nested among years of otherwise unremarkable consignment reports were a consistent pattern of sale prices reported to members running meaningfully below what buyers had actually paid, verified against a handful of public resale listings. Gallery visitor credit card statements Rosamund was able to subpoena, and outside appraisal records for pieces sold at estate auctions years later. Look at how consistently this gap shows up once you actually compare what buyers paid against what got reported to sellers. Rosamund told me, spreading years of consignment reports and outside sale verification documents across her office table obtained through the records request. Osgood reported one sale price to you, and every other member whose work sold through this gallery, and buyers, according to their own credit card statements, paid a consistently higher figure for years. I pulled my own professional experience with exactly this kind of discrepancy that same week. out of the same instinct that had once sent me tracking down an undervalued customs declaration by cross-referencing it against an item's actual verified market history. The pattern across the consignment records was remarkably consistent. Nearly every sale, regardless of medium or artist, showed the same proportional gap between what a buyer's own payment record showed and what the seller had actually been told and paid. I called Osgood that same week mostly to ask directly about the discrepancy before I brought the finding to the rest of the board. Every consignment report I've ever issued reflects the sale price I negotiated and collected on each artist's behalf, he said, with a confidence that struck me in hindsight as considerably more rehearsed than it had seemed in the play moment. Buyers sometimes pay additional gallery fees or framing costs that don't factor into the artist's own consignment percentage. That's standard practice in this business. That detail a 10-year gallery director's reputation for commercial fluency, apparently substituting for years for any actual verification of what buyers had really paid against what sellers were actually told, turned out to matter more than either of us understood. Standing in that conversation, Osgood Vane had served as Cypress Cove's gallery director for 10 consecutive years, a tenure built on a reputation earned early and never seriously questioned, since, as the one professional whose command of the actual commercial art market the rest of us simply didn't feel qualified to second-guess. Nobody in a decade of seasonal committee meetings had ever needed to ask what happened when the director entrusted with honestly reporting every artist's own sale price started quietly reporting less than buyers had actually paid. I want to answer plainly why Osgood believed he could run this pattern across 10 years without anyone noticing. The honest answer is that a consignment sale's integrity, for all the formality of a signed consignment agreement, ultimately depends on the artist actually verifying what a buyer paid against what the gallery reports in Cypress Cove. Like a lot of small artist colonies that outsource this kind of specialized commercial representation, had simply never had a reason to independently verify Osgood's reported sale prices before Rosamond's unrelated records review happened to catch the gap. Under California's specific art dealer statutes, which govern exactly this kind of consignment relationship, Rosamond discovered through subpoenaed credit card processing records and the buyer's own payment confirmations, Osgood had been retaining an undisclosed additional markup on top of his already disclosed commission on nearly every sale for a decade, generating proceeds totaling just over $180,000 across 10 years. Money that never once appeared in any financial statement the co-op board had ever reviewed and approved. I spent an evening that week going back through a decade of my own facilities committee notes and gallery meeting minutes, comparing them against my own personal consignment receipts, the same close patient cross-referencing I used to do, matching a suspect item's declared value against its actual verified market history during an active customs investigation. More than once I found a sale where a buyer's own payment record, which Rosamond had obtained through the subpoena, showed a clear purchase price, while the consignment receipt Osgood had actually given me for that same piece showed a meaningfully lower figure. The gap remarkably consistent sale after sale in a way that no honest accounting variation could explain. I called a former colleague from my customs days, a retired federal art fraud investigator named Otavia Marsh, who now consults on gallery and consignment fraud cases across the West Coast, mostly to ask whether the kind of scheme Rosamond had found was something she'd ever encountered elsewhere. I've seen individual dealers shave a single sale here and there, he told me over the phone, but a decade of a consistent, undisclosed markup against an entire colony's membership, that's a genuinely brazen scheme, precisely because it exploits exactly the kind of specialized trust a consignment arrangement depends on. Hearing that a pattern this specific still struck a career art fraud investigator as unusual was in its own way more unsettling than if it had simply been common. I want to note here something that took me a while to fully process myself. California's own art dealer statutes had always given any consignor the right to request a buyer's actual payment confirmation for any consigned sale at any time. A right almost nobody in this colony had ever exercised in a decade, myself included, simply because Osgood's consignment receipts were fluent enough on their face that asking to see a buyer's actual payment record felt almost like an accusation rather than routine diligence. I think about that reluctance more than almost anything else from this whole ordeal, how a genuinely reasonable norm deferring to specialized commercial expertise can quietly curdle into exactly the blind spot somebody's counting. The full picture once Rosamond retained an independent forensic accountant to reconcile 10 years of consignment receipts against subpoenaed buyer payment records and Osgood's own personal financial accounts was considerably worse than an occasional discrepancy. The accountant's report traced a consistent pattern. Nearly every sale across 10 years carried the same undisclosed markup, always deposited to Osgood's own personal accounts, always concealed behind consignment receipts that simply never disclosed the buyer's actual payment amount. This is the same shape as most of these schemes. Once you actually trace the buyer's own payment, instead of just reading the seller's receipt, the forensic accountant told the board laying 10 years of consignment receipts next subpoenaed payment records. A director with sole control over both what a buyer actually pays and what an artist gets told has no natural check on either function. It's the consistency across 10 straight years that makes the intent unmistakable. I want to be honest that I didn't fully appreciate until the accountant walked the board through it how much this scheme had actually put at risk beyond the diverted proceeds. Every artist in this colony depends on gallery sales for a meaningful share of their actual livelihood, and 10 years of a hidden markup meant every one of us had been quietly underpaid for our own work by the one professional entrusted, specifically with selling it fairly. I spent a weekend that fall sitting with the accountant's sale-by-sale comparison sheets, matching buyer payment confirmations against consignment receipts across 10 years. The same close patient cross-referencing I used to do matching a suspect shipment's actual contents against its declared manifest during an active fraud investigation. The gap between the two sets of numbers sale after sale was not subtle once laid side by side. I didn't have the authority to confirm anything beyond the documented receipts and payment records, but the shape of the pattern was becoming impossible to explain as anything other than deliberate, sustained underreporting. The forensic accountant pulled one more thread that reframed things again: California's consumer protection and art dealer registration statutes themselves, which Rosamond obtained the full relevant text of, explicitly classify registered art dealers knowing underreporting of a consigned sale price as a distinct form of theft by fraud, carrying criminal penalties considerably more serious than an ordinary commission dispute, since the law exists specifically to protect artists who depend entirely on a dealer's honest representation of what their own work actually sold for. I sat with the full forensic report alone one evening before bringing it to the rest of the board, mostly because I wanted to be certain of what I was actually looking at before asking 4 other volunteers to trust my read on something this serious. 10 years, $180,000 in undisclosed markups, and every member's own livelihood quietly shorted the whole time by the one man we'd trusted to sell our work honestly. My daughter Signe called that same night for our usual check-in, and found me still at the kitchen table with the report spread out well past midnight, and she stayed on the phone quietly while I talked through it out loud the same way. I used to work through a difficult provenance finding with a colleague before committing to a final recommendation. I brought the forensic report and Osgood's underreporting scheme directly to our co-op's 4 other board members at a specially called meeting, all of whom, to their credit, seemed genuinely stunned by the scale of what the documents showed. We trusted Osgood specifically because he was the one person who actually understood the commercial art market in real depth. Emeric Kettering told me, visibly shaken. I signed off on his sales reports for years, without ever once asking to see a buyer's actual payment confirmation. I understand now why that was more convenient for somebody than I ever realized. I requested Osgood's contract be terminated directly at that meeting, laying out the underreporting scheme in front of a room that included several artists whose own household budgets had, unbeknownst to them, been quietly shorted for a decade. Every consignment figure I've ever reported reflects my honest professional judgment about the actual net proceeds from each sale, Osgood said when the board invited him to respond. I don't believe there's any actual fraud here. Gallery operations involve a variety of legitimate fees that aren't always itemized on a consignment receipt. Buyers' own payment confirmations show a consistently higher figure than what you reported to the artists whose work you sold for 10 straight years, Emeric said. Unitemized fees don't explain a consistent, undisclosed markup on nearly every single sale this gallery ever made. A third board member, Verlaine Ashby, who'd joined the committee only 2 years earlier, and had grown close enough to the gallery's sales patterns to have noticed the commission percentages felt oddly inconsistent from piece to piece without ever fully naming the pattern, asked the question that seemed to land hardest in that room. Osgood, did you personally negotiate every one of these markups yourself? Or did anyone else at the gallery ever question why a buyer's payment never quite matched what got reported? Osgood's answer was a long pause, followed by an admission that he had in fact personally handled every sale transaction and every consignment receipt himself across all 10 years, detail that undercut whatever thin defense he might otherwise have offered about a staff member's independent billing decision. Rosamond laid out 3 paths forward, all running through channels considerably more serious than our earlier dispute with Rutger. First, the California Department of Justice's Consumer Protection Division needed formal notice of the underreporting scheme since the state maintains oversight of registered art dealers' consignment sale integrity. Second, California law treats a registered dealer's knowing underreporting of a consigned sale price as a distinct form of theft by fraud, a remedy considerably more serious than an ordinary commission dispute since the state treats concealed underpayment to consignors as theft, rather than a mere accounting disagreement. Third, the co-op deserved a straightforward civil path to recover the proceeds Osgood had personally diverted. I'd pursue all 3 simultaneously, Rosamond told the board. The department notice protects an art dealer registration system every consignor in this state depends on. The criminal referral treats this as the theft it actually is, rather than a mere commission dispute. And the disgorgement suit gives every affected artist a clean path to recover whatever Osgood personally diverted from their own sales. We filed formal notice with the California Department of Justice that winter attaching the forensic accountant's full report and 10 years of reconciled consignment receipts and payment records. We filed the criminal referral the same week and separately filed the civil disgorgement action, seeking recovery of Osgood's diverted proceeds on behalf of every affected artist. Here's the micro setback. The department's initial, while ultimately necessary, meant our colony lost its entire sales income during exactly the peak of the summer tourist season several artists depended on for the bulk of their annual earnings. This is the painful part of doing this the right way, Rosamond told me. A full audit protects the integrity of every artist's actual recovery. It also means the colony absorbs real short-term financial strain for a problem one person created. Emerick raised a second concern at that same meeting that hadn't fully occurred to me until he said it aloud. If Osgood anticipates this investigation dragging on, he said there's nothing stopping him from representing another small colony's gallery in the meantime, given how convincingly he can talk about the commercial art market. Rosamond agreed. The concern was legitimate, and flagged it directly to the state's art dealer registration office, which added a note to its own statewide file recommending any future artist colony verify a gallery director's reported sale prices against independent buyer confirmation before relying on self-reported consignment receipts. That winter stretched longer than I'd hoped, largely because both the department's full audit and the criminal referral moved at the deliberate pace these processes generally do, and more than one evening found me at my kitchen table with Rosamond's case binder wondering whether our artists would ever actually recover their own shorted proceeds before the next tourist season arrived without any functioning gallery at all. The turning point came when the department's own investigators, conducting a full independent reconciliation of every consignment sale against subpoenaed buyer records, rather than relying on any of Osgood's prior receipts, confirmed a clean, consistent markup pattern across the entire 10-year period, meaning restitution could proceed for every individual artist based on hard verified numbers rather than any disputed estimate. The department approved our colony's restitution plan within 8 weeks of that finding once the underreporting pattern was cleanly verified, sale by sale, allowing the gallery to resume consignment operations under a new director with a formal requirement for independent sale price verification against buyer payment confirmations going forward. Emerick Kettering called a special meeting that spring to formally present the results of both the department's investigation and the criminal referral. A meeting that drew a larger turnout than any co-op gathering I could remember. In 5 years, including several artists who'd never before attended a board meeting but who understand now exactly what a decade of unverified trust had quietly cost every one of their own sales. I spent the afternoon before that meeting walking the restored loading path alone, checking Rutger's relocated kiln shed one more time out of the same old habit that had started this whole process months earlier, and found myself thinking less about Osgood specifically than about how ordinary the whole slow drift into it must have felt from the inside. It's a strange thing standing on a stretch of gravel you've walked 100 times, to realize the actual buyer payment records that should have been checked all along had simply never been asked for. It just took someone willing to actually ask. Rutger, whose own resolved dispute now felt almost quaint by comparison, spoke during that meeting, addressing the room from the back. I want you all to know I've felt like part of this colony since my own situation got handled so fairly, he said. Hearing what Osgood did to people who trusted him for 10 years makes me even more grateful this community actually fixes its problems instead of just moving past them. The board voted unanimously that evening to formally terminate any possibility of rehiring Osgood and to adopt the state's required sale price verification process permanently, and Verlaine Ashby, who'd become one of the colony's most careful, detail-oriented board members, since her own pointed question weeks earlier, volunteered on the spot to serve as the gallery's new sales verification liaison, given how much she'd already learned about taking a specialized responsibility seriously. The department's office concluding the criminal investigation that summer charged Osgood with theft by fraud and forgery under California's Consumer Protection and Art Dealer Registration statutes, and the civil case that followed resulted in a disgorgement judgment covering the full value of the proceeds he'd personally distributed proportionally back to every affected artist based on the forensic reconciliation. Osgood pleaded guilty to the state charge that autumn rather than face a full trial on the complete scope of the case, accepting a sentence that included the disgorgement judgment, a term of probation, and a permanent revocation of his art dealer registration anywhere in the state again. The restitution order, once finalized, required Osgood to repay the diverted proceeds on a structured schedule with a portion of each payment directed specifically toward funding an independent consignment verification assistance program. The state now offers to small artist colonies something Rosamond told me was an unusually thoughtful addition to a restitution order of this kind. Most restitution just goes back to the affected parties and nobody outside your colony ever hears about it again, she said. Getting a piece of it earmarked toward actually helping the next small colony verify its own gallery director's sale prices is the kind of outcome that might genuinely help another community avoid exactly this situation. I called Octavia Marsh back once the restitution order was finalized, mostly because I felt she deserved to know that the scheme she'd found so unusual over the phone had turned out to match our situation almost exactly. I wish I could say I was surprised, she told me, but I'm glad you had the reconciliation to actually prove it this time instead of just a general sense that some of these small colonies are left with. I've thought about that phone call more than once since how then Leah Berting's surprise and to genuinely surprise a career art fraud investigator had still managed to run undetected in our own colony for 10 full years before an unrelated records review happened to catch it. People sometimes ask whether one county records error was really connected to a $180,000 consignment fraud scheme or whether I simply got lucky pulling at a loose thread. I don't think it was luck exactly, though I'll admit this one started from a genuinely different place than the failures I used to catch during my customs career, an honest county-level records gap that happened to put our attorney in front of documents that exposed something else entirely. But I don't think the two things were ever as separate as they first looked either. Both depended on the same quiet bet that a small California artist colony, having found one professional fluent enough to trust completely, would never think to check whether that fluency was still being applied honestly. The question underneath all of it was never really about one blocked loading path. It was about whether Cypress Cove could trust that the gallery selling every member's own livelihood-sustaining work was actually reporting what that work had really sold for, or whether that trust would get quietly exploited. Underreported sale at a time by whoever figured out how convenient nobody else's scrutiny had become. My daughter Signe asked me on one of her visits up from Sacramento not long after the settlement whether I regretted spending the better part of a year on a fight that started with a neighbor's misplaced kiln shed. I told her the honest truth. No, though I hadn't expected at 64 to spend most of a year reading state art dealer statutes and forensic accounting reports, instead of just throwing pots in my own studio the way I always have, every day since I retired. She told me that sounded exactly like the kind of thing I'd spent 27 years training for without ever expecting to actually need it again, which is about as fair an assessment as anyone's offered me since. I think about Osgood more than I expected to, honestly, in the months since this resolved. 10 years is a long time to hold a colony's trust honestly before a pattern like this takes hold. I don't think he set out in year one planning anything like what it eventually became. I suspect the first small markup taken quietly during a slow season when his own gallery expenses were running higher than his commission covered. Felt like a reasonable adjustment. He told himself he'd correct once business improved, and each subsequent year simply got easier to justify than admitting the first one had ever happened. I don't offer that as an excuse. I offer it because it's a more useful lesson than simply calling him greedy and moving on. Since the version of this story where somebody sets out from day one to steal from an entire colony of working artists is rarer than the version where somebody drifts into it one convenient markup at a time. Our loading path runs clear and open again where Rutgers Foundation once sat, and I've taken to walking that stretch most mornings during a firing week the same way I always did before any of this happened, just to confirm it for myself. Rutger stops by my studio most weeks now, mostly to compare notes on kiln temperatures since he's become considerably more involved in the colony's shared firing schedule than he ever expected to be. And I don't hold any of this against him. He was as much a man who trusted an official's wrong answer as anyone. Emeric Kettering pushed through a permanent bylaw amendment requiring the state's sale price verification process. Our own gallery had always technically been free to require, finally adopted, plus a mandatory second signature from a board member on every consignment sale above a modest threshold regardless of how trusted any single director becomes. The county, for its part, formally audited its entire cross-reference system for older recorded easements across the whole region. Once our case became public, correcting several other similar gaps before another applicant, like Rutger, could stumble into one of them unknowingly. Verlaine Ashby has taken to giving informal talks at our general meetings a couple of times a year now, walking newer members through the actual mechanics behind our loading path easement and our gallery's sales verification process, the way the founders understood them, since she says half disputes a colony like ours ever runs into start with somebody simply not understanding why a rule exists in the first place. A lesson she says she learned the hard way herself. I sat in on the first one myself, notebook in hand out of old habit, and found myself just as absorbed as any of the newcomers hearing her explain a system I'd reviewed cold for years but had never once heard laid out in quite that plain, patient way. The new sale price verification process the state now requires has kept every buyer payment, confirmation, and every consignment receipt open to any artist who asks a policy so simple. I sometimes wonder why it took a scheme this size to make it standard practice here. I've stopped by our new verification liaison's records more than once, now not because I doubt anything, but because I've found I like the reassurance of checking now and then. The same way I used to review a closed provenance file once more after a case wrapped, just to be sure. I think too about how differently this could have gone if Rutgers County records gap had been the whole story and none of us had ever thought to look any deeper into how our own gallery's sales actually worked. It's a lesson I've carried back into how I sell my own work now. I ask for a copy of every buyer's payment confirmation myself. Now, not because I distrust the new verification system, but because I understand now, in a way I didn't fully appreciate before this happened, how easily even an honest system can quietly stop checking its own work once everyone gets comfortable enough to stop asking. I got a call last month from a board member at a small artist colony further north along the Oregon coast, a woman named Theodora Quist, who'd read about our case in a regional arts council newsletter and wanted to know how we'd gone about proving the underreporting held up under real scrutiny. I spent the better part of an hour on the phone with her, walking through the same sale-by-sale cross-check I'd run almost by instinct the week. Rosamond first noticed the discrepancy in my own consignment records. I told her the same thing. I'd tell any small colony in this position, don't start by assuming bad faith. Start by simply asking to see the buyer's own payment confirmation because an honest director will produce it without hesitation. And the one who can't or won't has usually already told you everything you actually need to know. It struck me hanging up that call that this was probably closer to the actual point of all of it than any restitution figure or criminal conviction. One more small colony somewhere else on this coast, now knowing exactly what to check and exactly how to ask for it before their own trusted director's convenience quietly became something else entirely. I think, too, about how much of my own certainty in this whole ordeal came from a career most of my neighbors never fully understood the shape of. Customs authentication work teaches you a particular kind of stubbornness about verifying a claim against its actual source, since a document's stated value, meaning something other than what actually changed hands, isn't a hypothetical risk out there. It's the entire basis of a fraud case. I didn't consciously import that stubbornness into a volunteer seat on a small colony's facilities committee. It just came with me the same way. A particular way of reading a receipt for what it doesn't say comes with you wherever you go, and I've come to think it's exactly the kind of stubbornness a small artist colony needs. Somewhere on its board, even if most members would never think to, look for it in a retired customs inspector. Customs work also taught me something else, something I didn't fully appreciate until Osgood, that the most convincing frauds are almost never the ones built on outright lies. They're built on a technically true statement told in a way designed to keep you from asking the one follow-up question that would unravel it. Buyers sometimes pay additional gallery fees was in some narrow sense true. It just wasn't the whole truth, and it was phrased with exactly enough plausibility that a room full of trusting artists never thought to ask what those fees actually were or where they went. I've started teaching a small informal class here now, mostly for newer members, on reading a consignment receipt the way I used to read a customs declaration looking specifically for what a technically accurate document chooses not to. Sigh. I didn't do any of this out of anger at Rutger, whose honest reliance on a county official's wrong answer started this whole chain of events, or even really at Osgood, though I won't pretend the scale of what he was willing to risk. Over 10 years of underreporting his own colony's almond sales doesn't still trouble me when I think about it. I did it because that loading path and that gallery were both built by artists who understood this colony couldn't survive without honest shared access and an honestly reported sale, and because American Verlaine and a room full of neighbors were willing once somebody showed them what was actually happening to stand up and say it mattered. Turns out that's most of what keeping a colony's promise intact actually requires. Somebody willing to keep checking the actual payment against the actual receipt, and enough neighbors willing when it matters to show up and ask why the numbers don't add up. This video is a dramatized storytelling narrative based on real-life themes and homeowners association, consumer protection, and art dealer regulations. Names, characters, and specific locations are fictional or have been changed for privacy. Visuals are generated using AI tools for illustrative purposes only. This content is for entertainment purposes and does not constitute legal advice. If your community's most trusted professional has been handling something highly specialized without much outside verification for years, would you know how to check whether that expertise is still being applied honestly